This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.
Welcome to Getting Started with Identity Lifecycle Management, Part 2. Now let's check out how all this is configured. Now, order does make a difference when it comes to enabling provisioning. First, you need to match up which field from OneLogin will be used to uniquely identify users within the application. This will be among the basic parameters that need to be sent to the application. Then you'll need to specify the URL endpoint of the app. It could be an actual URL that's unique for your org, or just a subdomain or ID you've been assigned by the application. Then you need to actually configure API access. So this could be done by providing, say, a username and password of an account that has the ability to execute against the API, or it could be by enabling OAuth between OneLogin and the application. Finally, you actually get to enable provisioning. It's just a checkbox. Pretty easy to do. Then you need to do this little fun step called refresh entitlements. So remember we mentioned with those entitlement mappings that you need to pull those mappings in from the application. Like, what Office 365 groups have you created? You created a sales group, you created a marketing group, created an engineers group. So you need to pull those existing groups, at least the names of them, into OneLogin. So now you can choose from them when you are assigning them as, say, default values or through those rules that we mentioned. So refresh entitlements is taking that API connection that you just set up and actually connecting to the applications to pull in those values. And finally, you can go ahead and configure those default entitlement application parameters, again, if there are entitlements, or just the default application parameters in general. Then you can get the little more specific parts. So that's when you can do those rules that we mentioned. So configure your defaults first, then go and get specific. Like for those in the sales department, I want to assign them to the Office 365 sales group. That's what we use rules for. And we make sure the rules get applied to everybody by executing a little command called refresh entitlement mappings. Yeah, that sounds a little confusing, but at one point the rules really were called entitlement mappings and the step is still called refresh entitlement mappings. Maybe someday it'll change. So again, first configure those basic parameters. So we see Office 365 here, we see Salesforce. Again, parameters tab for those app connectors. And we're talking about, at minimum, configuring the identifying value. So for Salesforce, that would be their email address, which is really their user ID as well. And for Office 365, that would be a matter of configuring their UPN, or user principal name. So again, unfortunately, for a lot of these things, it takes a little bit of knowledge of the application itself, sometimes to figure out exactly what those parameters are. Then we have the URL. And again, if you look over on the right-hand side, we have a full URL, https login.salesforce, and it's followed by an org ID that's assigned to your Salesforce account. Over on the left, you see another app called Samanage. In that case, you're not specifying full URL, just the account name that you registered with, again, that particular application when you set it up for your organization. Once you specify those pieces, then you can go down towards the bottom and enable the API connection. Again, how that gets enabled will differ depending upon the application. For Samanage over on the left there, we can see there's a username and password you need to specify, and then click on the enable button. So that username and password should belong to a Samanage account that has the ability to execute API calls. Over on the right-hand side, you see it says Salesforce OAuth on that Salesforce app connector, and it has an authenticate button. So when you click on that, it's going to look to see, are you logged into hopefully you need to be logged into Salesforce with admin credentials, but it's going to have a pop-up where you then need to basically approve OneLogin access to Salesforce using OAuth. So once you've configured that URL or that endpoint, once you have enabled API access, then you can go down to the provisioning tab and do the simple step of check the checkbox that says enable provisioning and click save. Once you have enabled provisioning, then you can do the magic of refresh entitlements. Again, what does that mean? Well, the physical step means click on where it says refresh down there at the bottom. What's it going to do at that point? Well, it's going to take that API connection that you set up and go and connect to the application and pull in available values for the entitlements, like what Office 365 groups did you create? What Google groups have you created? What Salesforce roles or profiles do you have over there? And it's going to pull those values in so that they appear as values that you can now assign through the app connector here during provisioning. You can check to see whether this completed successfully or not by going and looking at events. So again, this is where that whole flexible entitlement mapping piece of the lifecycle management comes into play. So once you've done the refresh entitlements, then you can go back over to that parameters tab and start maybe configuring default entitlements. So select the values that are related to like what they're authorized to do within the application. In this case, we're looking at G Suite and Google Groups, kind of control that. And you can click on where it says no transform there and then choose an appropriate Google group. Well, in this case, since I'm setting it on the parameters tab, be a default Google group that all users will be assigned to when they are provisioned into G Suite or Google Workspaces, we now call it. Again, if refresh entitlements had not completed successfully, I wouldn't see anything in this dropdown. Those values, company news, HR team, product, support, those were all pulled in from G Suite. They were defined over within G Suite as Google groups. And after you finish doing some of those entitlements, you can of course go through and configure any of the other parameters that are being sent over by default during provisioning. So you can select any of the standard fields like their first name or last name or manager there or phone number, and then match it to a field that exists within OneLogin. So for example, over on the right-hand side, we see phone over in G Suite matching to the phone field that's over in OneLogin. This is also where those custom attributes could come into play. You see a field up there for country code. There's another field for like their mobile phone or their organization name, or those kinds of fields aren't default basic fields in OneLogin. So if you want those fields to be populated within G Suite or Google Workspace, then you need to create custom user attributes or custom user fields within OneLogin, figure out how you're going to populate them, and then you can match them or map them to these parameters that are being sent over, in this case, to G Suite as part of provisioning. Some of those fields, by the way, maybe you don't want to necessarily exactly match them to an existing user field within OneLogin. So you do have a little bit of creativity that you can do using what we call macros. So instead of choosing an existing field from that value dropdown, again, an existing OneLogin field, you can choose macro. And it will allow you to either enter in just a static value, like we see here, language field is being matched to just EN, so by default everybody's language is English, or you can use a little bit more complex placeholders. If you look up macro attributes, you can find out more about those. And then we have that offboarding process. So provisioning is all about the creation. Deprovisioning or offboarding is about what happens when they leave the organization. So we have a couple more options here that you can configure when a user is, say, deleted from OneLogin, or the app is just removed from the list of apps they have access to. You can choose what will happen within the application. Because remember, provisioning kicks off when a user is added to the app, either manually or through a role. So deprovisioning kicks off when a user is, say, removed from the role or just deleted from OneLogin. So do you want them to be deleted within the application when that happens? Do you want their status to remain the same? Or do you want to maybe disable them? And then the other option right below, when user is suspended in OneLogin. Again, it's just a matter of what do you want to have happen within the application itself. Don't do anything within the application, or suspend them within the application as well. Your offboarding process, you really have to kind of plan that out well. Figure out, like, do I want to delete the account? Do I need to keep that account around? Do I maybe need to reassign some objects to, like, their manager? Offboarding users can be a little tricky here, but at least maybe suspending them does ensure that they don't have any access to the app. And again, that's the user deprovisioning process. And then last but not least, of course, is the whole approval process, right? So create, update, or delete. By default, where it says require admin approval before this action is performed, all those checkboxes are checked. So by default, when a user is created, any updates made to them, or they are deleted, they have to be approved. That change has to be approved before it is actually sent over to the application. That is that admin approval workflow that we mentioned earlier. Again, you can go over to the provisioning page under the users menu, manually approve any users from there, again, if that approval is still enabled, or you can do it from the users tab on the application. So next we're going to take a look at how all of this. All right, so let's go check out an application that we've configured for provisioning and see how it all works. So I'm going to go to applications, and we're going to torture Salesforce because that's fun. And let's go check out the settings that we just talked about. So first is the configuration tab. I've got a Salesforce login URL here. And again, what value needs to specify there is going to be different on a per application basis. In this case, what's unique to it is this org ID that I can actually find over in Salesforce here. And then in this case, we're using a more recent version of Salesforce. There are different versions of the API available here. We're using actually the most recent version that's available there. And thus we're using OAuth to make our connection to Salesforce. So that has already been configured. Then again, if we were doing this from scratch, we would go over to the provisioning tab. We'll check that little checkbox there that says enable provisioning. Make sure that that's saved. And then we'd have to go back to the provisioning tab and click on this little guy right here, the refresh entitlements. So when I click on it, it doesn't look like a whole bunch has happened. If you want to make sure stuff is happening, you can actually see it over in events. So I can see here entitle refresh started for Salesforce. And if I refresh this a few times, I'll eventually see where it finished. So right now, again, making that API call, pulling in those entitlement values. Again, they will differ on a per application basis. So let's go over to Salesforce, and we'll look now at the parameters tab. So on the parameters tab over here, we're now going to be able to assign, again, those default values. So, right, we have already by default for Salesforce, email is mapped to email and user ID is mapped to email as well here. But these fields here, permission set, profile, roles, for example, those are some of those entitlements that are over in Salesforce. So again, I click on those, and if I click the little drop down right here, all these values that pop up, again, those have been predefined over in Salesforce. So Salesforce administrator, or like out of the box in Salesforce, this is what is available, and they got pulled into OneLogin, and I can now see them in this permission set drop down because I did that refresh entitlement step. So that also means, by the way, that if I create some like new roles or define new permission sets within my Salesforce instance, that I'm going to want to refresh entitlements again, because if I want to start assigning users to those new objects, they need to be available in OneLogin. How do they get into the OneLogin instance? Refresh entitlements. So that guy might come up again over, whatever period of time you'll be managing this. So go through and again, as necessary, match up these kind of default values. Next, again, I could do rules, but let's just make sure the provisioning's working here. So let's actually assign a user. And in fact, I actually already assigned a user, DDoS, and we can see that she got provisioned. And thus, what we should see is DDoS exists over here within Salesforce. Here we're in the Salesforce admin dashboard, looking at users, and we can see Miss DDoS over here. So if I were to assign a new user, so I'll just manually assign a user. Let's do, how about domain? My name's amuse me. And I'm going to go to the applications tab, and I'm going to click this plus over here, and I'm going to choose Salesforce and continue. I'm okay with all these matchings at this point. And so in fact, I can see that DOM is pending right here. So it didn't automatically happen. Why? Right, so I'm seeing it pending. It's not like provisioned yet. If I go and refresh my users over here in Salesforce, I don't see DOM listed. I told you it was automatic. Why isn't it there? What's wrong? Well, remember I also told you the default setting for these applications when you configure provisioning is it is waiting for approval. It's these checkboxes. It's these checkboxes, specifically right now, this create user checkbox, that is holding up the actual creation of that account over in Salesforce. So at this point, I should probably approve it. And I can do that multiple places. I can do it from the users tab here, click on pending, click approve there. By the way, I have to click on where it says pending. If I click elsewhere, it just shows me the properties that are matched up. So just FYI, pending is unique there. I can go back to the user themselves. Oops, not demo admin. Domain and demo admin. Can't get confused there. Go to applications, and I can click on pending here. Approve it through here. Or if I want to do a whole bunch at once, and I think that they have been assigned out to me, I can see them over on the provisioning page here. So anyway, 3 different ways to get to the same pop-up, and I will approve my friend Dom. So let's go check. We can see him over in Salesforce under users. It failed. Reason it's failed is I exceeded my license limit, but I also get information here. So if it fails, right, I need to troubleshoot. So there's usually any sort of failures, any sort of errors. I'm going to get some information right here. This one's telling me, again, I've exceeded my license limit. That's because I just have a trial account over there, and I do have limited users that I can create in it. But again, we can see that that call went through because I approved it. It just failed over on the Salesforce side because of my licenses. So now maybe I should actually pay for the Salesforce account, or forget about Dom and he's not going to get an account. And of course, we can do a little bit of fine-tuning when it comes to those parameters by using our lovely rules. So here we have an example of a rule. Again, notice it says edit mapping. 1 point, these things are called entitlement mappings. Don't get totally confused. This is a rule. Okay. But the rule says if their state or region field contains the word East and their department equals sales, again, those conditions are pulling from any of my user fields, standard, directory, or custom fields. But if user matches this criteria, then set their role in Salesforce to the Eastern sales team. And notice you can even kind of test it out. You can type a user's name in there down below, click on check, and it will tell you whether the user matches those conditions or not. So rules themselves, again, created at the application level. Guess what? Go to the Rules tab, click on the aptly named Add Rule button. And once you create those rules, they will fire off automatically when users are created or updated. But if you want the rules to apply to all your existing users, go make the changes right then you need to do a little manual step underneath more actions there and choose the reapply entitlement mappings. That makes sure it goes through all existing users assigned to this application, and it will apply the appropriate changes to them if they match the criteria. Also, keep in mind, order can make a difference. So if like one rule might assign, a user to a particular Office 365 group, and another rule assigns that same user, because the user matches the criteria of both rules, to an Office 365 group, they will be assigned to both groups. If the rule is modifying a particular attribute, so one rule updates the user's division field within the application, and another rule also updates the division field, and again, I've got a user that matches the criteria of both rules, then whichever rule fires off last, that one wins. So like 1 versus 2, 2 would win. That means the user would end up in the division that is defined within rule 2. Not tool, 2. Anyway, so order does make a difference. Be careful when you're defining these. Usually it actually makes more of a difference when we're talking about mappings. So those are more widespread. Rules, we don't always end up with those kind of conflicts going on, but just keep that fact in mind. So let's check out some rules in the example we already worked with. All right, so let's go check out some rules, right? We've got Salesforce configured for provisioning. We know that it does provision. We at least got Miss DDoS provision there, and we just ran out of licenses. So we're going to go check out rules. Now, remember again, rules are about assigning particular entitlements to different subsets of users based upon their attributes, or even assigning different values to them within the application during provisioning. So I've got 2 rules that I already defined here. One says if department equals marketing, assign them to a role within Salesforce called the marketing team. And the other one says if department equals engineering, assign them to a role in Salesforce called customer support international. So can actually kind of check to see if our logic's right. Maybe user attributes are correct by typing in a user name here. So again, we know Miss DDoS already working as far as provisioning is concerned. And I do happen to know she's in the engineering department. So it should show that she would be mapped, but it actually doesn't. It says that she wouldn't be mapped. So there's something off here. So it's either my logic is off here, which is pretty simple. So department equals engineering, did I misspell engineering? No, engineering looks like it's spelled okay there. So something's probably off actually with her user account. So let's go check out her user account and see what might be up. So let's go look, and department, oh look, there are only 2 E's in that part of engineering. Thus, it didn't match, right? It was misspelled here. And I'm just pointing this out. I'm bringing this to the forefront here, because it's really important when you're using things like rules or the mappings that, again, we mentioned earlier, that the values here are correct. They're not misspelled, that, the spacing is right, all these kinds of things. So it's really nice when these user accounts are being generated based upon the fact that maybe they're like syncing from some other system where we know the people in charge of that system. It's really important to make sure that that data is accurate and up to date. So no matter what, really want to make sure that this is accurate, well spelled type of data. So I fixed her little problem there. So we can go back over to the application and go into Salesforce. And let's go to my rule, engineering team, and let's test it out. It's not making any change to her. It's just saying, again, does the criteria apply to her? And now when I click check, yeah, she would be mapped. So let's go check our user account out. So what is it? We've got DDoS here, and currently her role is set for installation and repair services. So what we want is we want her to be customer support international. So anytime we change a user account, update a user, that should cause the change to go over, should cause that provisioning to kick in. And in fact, since we fixed the spelling on her account, we should actually see that she's in that international customer support. So why didn't it automatically go through? Well, what do we have enabled? We have that approval process enabled. So again, this is an update. Updates are requiring admin approval, right? Here's that provisioning tab, an update. It is requiring admin approval. So it detected the change, but it hasn't sent it through until we approve it. So we see it as pending over here. Let's click approve. Now it should be updating her over there. And provisioned, woohoo! So let's refresh over on the Salesforce end. And we can see her role is now customer support international. So that was the rule firing off because we had made a change to her account. If we want to make sure that this gets applied to like all of our existing users and not wait until some sort of change occurs to them, then we can do this more actions, reapply, entitlement mappings kind of step. And that would go back through all users that are assigned to that app, make sure the rules are run against them and the appropriate changes are made. Now, again, in this case, because approval is required, the changes won't be made absolutely automatically. You will have to go in and approve them as I just did for Miss DDoS. This concludes part 2 of Getting Started with Identity and Lifecycle Management. Please continue on to part 3.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.